Welcome to a video about Prince of Persia, just for a change. This time I wanted to do something a little different from my usual videos and put together an investigation into how the game compares across different platforms. Shortly after the game came out, it was ported to just about every other computer, console and calculator that was in existence at the time, and many of the conversions are very different. I wrote an article on this a few years ago, but because nobody can read anymore and would prefer to go on Twitter and post photographs of their lunch, I wanted to revive the idea and demonstrate some of them myself. What's up on the screen now is the DOS version programmed by Lance Grudy with the oversight of original author Jordan Mechner, and together with the nearly identical one that came out for the Amiga, I think this is the one that most people remember. The game is what you might call a cinematic platformer, though the term hadn't been invented at the time, where your objective is to get from the dungeons to the top of the palace and defeat the evil Grand Vizier Jafar before he nabs the princess. You've got one real-time hour to get there through the game's 12, 13 or 14 levels depending on how you count them. Normal as it might seem in this day and age, the most notable thing about the game was that it was one of the first popular titles to feature a character that actually moved like a human being instead of a cartoon plumber able to jump 5 times his height. The palace is full of guards and unlikely mechanical traps, and you've only got your jumping, climbing and sword fighting abilities to help you make it through, all traced from video frames of Jordan Mechner's brother. It's also remarkable for its smooth feel. The game is laid out on a grid, but great pains have been made to make it not feel like it. The game knows when you're approaching a drop and will align you with the edge when you jump, or slide you over just a little bit to climb up to a higher ledge should you require it. It never feels like you're fighting the controls or dying through no fault of your own, and it's details like this that make the game really enjoyable to play. To give you some context, I'll show you a rough outline of the game that I know, and a few important things about it that I'm going to be measuring the ports up against. The game has 12-ish levels of roughly increasing difficulty, starting with you unarmed in a cell, having to go and retrieve a sword in a usefully tutorial-like series of dungeon rooms, and then fighting your way past the first garden up towards the palace. On level 3, you enter a fight with a suddenly reanimated skeleton, and you have to push him off a ledge due to not being able to hurt him. Once you reach the palace, a mysterious mirror suddenly appears, releasing your reflection, who later returns to bother you, and after an encounter with the game's overweight mid-boss, he eventually sends you back down into the dungeon again to begin the second half of the game. You make your way back up, with the help of a mouse if you're not fast enough, reach the palace again and get to the top of the tower where you confront your doppelganger, getting past him by putting away your sword and fusing back together again. After that, you fight Jafar on top of a precarious bridge of platforms, open the final exit and run to victory and the princess, and I hope nobody watching this video was planning on being too wary about spoilers. Like I said, the movement is responsive, satisfying and consistent throughout. Jumping forward from standing still will take you 2 tiles and a running jump will clear 3. Obstacles such as spikes and these biting gates will get in your way. The gates can be dealt with by using the gift of good timing to step or run through them, and you'll only die on the spikes if they spring up when you run directly through them and land on them from a height. Carefully stepping through them or even stopping on them and then starting to run again is fine. Sword fighting uses 2 buttons. When you face a guard, the prince draws his sword automatically. You can hit the action button to lunge and then press up to block when your opponent strikes. You can also string these 2 moves together in a block and strike, and then a block again and so on if you're fighting a capable swordsman. If you're feeling confident, you can walk into a guard to switch places with them, and with the risk of turning your back on the opponent, you can choose to put your sword away to escape from a fight as well. That's a brief tour of what happens in this game. I'm going to see if the other conversions worked as well, but for a start, let's step back to look at the original release. Prince of Persia was first published by Brøderbund in 1989 on the Apple II home computer. It was programmed entirely by Jordan Mechner, taking inspiration from his previous game Karateka, along with Arabian Nights and adventure films like Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Apple II was already at the end of its lifespan when the game came out, and the publisher never gave it a lot of attention, and so the game sold poorly until the ports picked up. Going back to the Apple II version after having been familiar with the PC one, it's difficult not to expect it to be a lot more crude. The graphics are obviously significantly less sophisticated, but it's impressive what it does with its limited colour palette in both cutscenes and gameplay with its speckledy backgrounds. There are only a couple of different guard colour palettes, but in some ways they're diverse. It's nice to see that, as evil as he might be, Jafar is an early pioneer of equal opportunities employment, as many of his guards are Smurfs. The sound does a decent job for only having one channel to play with. You get footfalls, the sound of gates opening and closing, and the ominous snip of the biting gates, although some of the music is a bit on the shrill side. Something else I'm glad was altered for the PC version is the way that after drinking a potion or defeating a guard, you'll have to watch the prince standing there contemplating the situation while the music plays until you get control back. But the real surprise and what made this game stand out is just how smooth and responsive it is to play. This is remarkable on a system this old, especially compared to the shambolic horror show that we'll be seeing from the other machines of the era a little later on. Even just looking at the game now, it's easy to imagine players of 1989 being amazed by it. The prince moves in an incredibly lifelike fashion at a much greater frame rate than you'd expect the machine to be capable of. Jordan Mechner really paid a lot of attention to how the prince felt to control, and it pays off. Due to the limitations of the hardware, the game slows down a lot whenever a few objects are moving on the screen, but sometimes this just makes it look like you're abusing the time-altering powers of the later prince and are going to slow motion for a dramatic getaway. So the Apple II version is a technical marvel for running this well on a machine that came out in the early 1980s. It works well enough for me to have been comfortable playing through it in one sitting, and it's fascinating to see how much of the DOS game that I know it was able to squeeze in. Next, let's take a look at how the game did later in the Apple lineage. The Macintosh port of the game came from Presage software a couple of years later in 1992, and before I go any further I want to give special mention to the genius who decided to make the archive extractor Stuffit only downloadable as a Stuffit archive, making my attempt to run this version of the game far more complicated than it needed to be. I've got to say that as someone who was a PC owner, I'm quite jealous of this version. It looks like what in modern terms would be called a high-definition remake, except unlike those, it isn't terrible. In fact, I suspect that some of the graphics in the introduction were originally drawn at this resolution and then downscaled for the PC. The sound effects are the same as the samples that were used on the PC if you were rich and had a sound card, but the music has had a pompous and very impressive makeover. The game can run in two modes. If you have it on 256 colours, you'll get something that's a tiny bit like the graphics of the PC version, but with the resolution doubled and the graphics redrawn to suit. It doesn't have the tile randomisation that the PC has, and so it can look a little uniform, but overall the appearance is very nice. The sprites, especially for the guards, are more bold and colourful, and they almost look cartoonish with their black outlines. Run it in black and white, and you get a sort of animated comic book instead, albeit a bit of a violent one. This mode was included for compatibility with earlier Macs, which only had 1-bit colour for reasons I don't really understand, but for something as limited as that, to make it look coherent at all is an impressive thing. The mechanics of the game are nice and precise, the edge detection of the platforms is perfect, and you won't find yourself dying because of any momentary failures of physics. The only trouble is that the game runs at a very sluggish pace, and I don't think it's the fault of the virtual machine I was running this on. Everything is tuned to run just a little bit slower than the PC version. This makes it very nerve-wracking when you're gearing up to treacle yourself through a biting gate, and makes combat more difficult because the rhythm for blocking and striking is different. So the Macintosh version isn't exactly a bad port, but you would expect something a bit more for a game that was released 3 years after the original and far superior hardware. But around the same year, the big-name consoles of the time were getting in the act and showed us just how wrong this game can go given the opportunity. Right, am I going to have to go through this again? This is the Nintendo version in all its mediocrity, published by Virgin and developed by Motivetime Limited, and much to my aggravation I played this to the end in a very old video with about 4,000 retakes. To be fair to the game, it doesn't look that bad for a console that was released in 1983 and that had already been superseded by the time this game came out. The prints and other graphics actually appear more or less like in the PC version, if slightly purpler. One obvious difference is that scrolling is used in this game because of the NES's square screen output. The game needs to scroll screens left and right so that they're all in play at once. And music has also been added, but you'll find yourself muting it very quickly because it consists of the same 8 bars of one tune repeated throughout the entire game. Things actually start off well with this one. In the first couple of screens the feel of the controls seems right, but it isn't long before the cracks start showing. The movement, which at first seems reasonable, has a number of faults, a fairly major one of which is that the cling on button doesn't really work. Sometimes the prince will even get hold of a platform then immediately let go of it, which means you die through no fault of your own, a frustrating problem in any game. In what you might call the opposite problem, it's often also impossible to climb down from a ledge and you have to fall off and hope instead. Also on the list of broken things is the combat. Not only is it remarkably hit or miss, but some of the sprites have been cut out and it doesn't look like they're using swords at all, instead doing some sort of ancient Morris dancing with white rods. They've taken out bits as well. You can't run away, switch places or be knocked off platforms, and a lot of the levels have been altered slightly to make sure you don't try. But the oddest thing about this version is that it forgets to put some of the game's most iconic moments in. On level 3 you fight a skeleton, which is a shock moment in the original because you suddenly have to deal with an enemy you can't hurt and end up backing him into a pit. But here he's functionally just a slightly unhealthier guard and can be knocked down as normal. The mirror is present and the shadow turns up a couple of times during the game, but then at the climax, when you're meant to face off against him, it just completely gives up and throws another skeleton at you instead. It makes that whole running storyline meaningless and skips one of the game's cleverest moments. And as for the end of the game and your final confrontation with Jafar, forget about that as well, you just find a normal guard at the top of the tower and a masterclass of anticlimax. I know this can't be a space issue because these things were intact in versions on much more primitive hardware, it's just proof that Jordan Mechner was blessed with the rare advantage of caring what he was doing. Let's take a look at what they did on the Game Boy. Squeezing Prince of Persia onto the Game Boy must surely have been a challenge at the time, and surprisingly at first glance Virgin managed this one significantly better than the NES version. Almost uniquely among the console versions, the movement is smooth and it feels right. It even jumps you at the edge of platforms correctly, although there are still a couple of lapses at vital moments. You have to get used to the upward jump not edging you forwards, and the prince doesn't use his careful step to get up to the edge of a cliff, but instead happily walks off it. But apart from that it works well, enough to make me confident about getting through level 1 without relying on save states to pull me out of unfair deaths. The prince, or his stand-in here, some sort of blank-faced abomination from Doctor Who, retains his nice animation in fewer pixels and even gets some new ones, like when he pancakes into a wall when you run him into it, and when you pick up a potion you can actually see him pouring it into his non-mouth through the transparent glass. Some of the moments from the game that the NES version forgot to put in are restored, most importantly remembering to include the game's main enemy, and the skeleton fight is also back, this time against a ghost, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense as a sword would surely just waft through him rather than knock him back, but the effort is there. However, the team knew that no console version of Prince would be complete without one vast cock-up, and they chose to put theirs in the unapologetically dreadful sword fighting. Neither the block nor strike buttons work half the time, and even if they do, you'll often see your sword going straight through the guard you're trying to fight. There's no visual feedback when you get hit at all either, so the outcome of combat feels arbitrary and very unsatisfying. It's a shame because this was almost a decent port, but combat is such a large and necessary part of the game that the clear amount of effort that went into it just went towards creating a substandard experience. In 1999, this version was re-released on the new iteration of the hardware, the Game Boy Color, this time by Red Orb Entertainment. It's definitely the same game, with no attempt to improve the mechanics, just with a coat of paint and with the black outlines of the sprites removed. These days it looks a bit like a deliberately primitive Flash game. The major addition is of a training mode available from the menu hallway, a course where you can grow accustomed to jumping over chasms and having sharp spikes rammed through your head. It's a nice thought, but it seems fairly pointless because there's nothing here to level 1 that the game doesn't teach you anyway. Moving to Sega's efforts now, Prince of Persia on the Game Gear or Master System makes a couple of changes to the story, setting the game in a palace orbiting a black hole where physics as we know them don't apply. Throughout even the most pathetic versions of this game, the jumping rules are at least consistent. A standing jump will take you over 2 tiles and a running jump will clear 3. Here instead, you can launch yourself most of the way across a screen with a standing jump, and the running jump takes you a similar distance but works so rarely that I didn't want to experiment to find out if it was actually longer. Momentum only works for a limited time, and at the peak of your jump you'll slam into an invisible wall and drop straight down. And on the ground, watch out for the spikes because the rules for walking into and out of them are shaky at best and they'll leap up and grab you given the slightest chance. Due to the strong gravitational anomalies, the levels are twisted around a little as well, and a couple of elements in them are swapped around for no apparent reason. For example, the biting gate has been taken out of level 3's main route, but you can still find them if you go looking. However, the makers toned down the result of being caught in one and replaced the frankly horrifying spectacle of the PC graphics with the prince just glumly getting stuck like a honey-filled Winnie the Pooh wedged halfway out of a burrow. There are some good things about it though. The graphics are new and they're pleasant, putting a lot more colour into the game compared to the other version's monochrome dungeons, and the music is pretty high quality. Experiencing this version was worth it just to hear the fanfare when you pick up the sword. There's an interstitial hourglass screen with some wonderful tense music between levels and deaths as well, constantly reminding you of your time limit. An option screen is provided where you can make things harder but not easier for yourself, allowing you to start with reduced lives or a frankly impossible starting time. Combat is a bit of a mixed bag. As I'm beginning to expect from the console versions, it's entirely broken, but it's at least broken in your favour. The correct way to fight in this game is to ignore the barely responsive block button, stand on the spot and smash attack repeatedly. Guards will usually walk into your attacks and frequently forget that they're supposed to be fighting you at all. Overall, this is a very weird version. The movement and combat are both completely wrong, but in ways that don't make them quite as bad as some of the other ones. Now I'm going to take a look at some less universally known systems. The Amstrad CPC was a competitor to the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum that took hold in the British and West European markets during the late 80s. Its version of Prince of Persia was ported by a company I don't even know how to pronounce. I think I'll just call it Microïds, even though it might be Microïds, or as it's French, something like Microïds. Even though the system was so old by the time the game came out, a surprising amount of effort has gone into this port. The in-game graphics are original and pleasantly colourful. The prince's movement looks less smooth because of the game running at a lower frame rate, but he controls well, it's responsive and reliable, and in general the controls don't get in the way, barring the occasional sudden air brakes problem. There's an odd decision of splitting the simple one-button controls over 2 different ones. One button for sword attacks, cling on and pick up items, and the other for careful steps, so you have to really pay attention to where your hands are when you want to step up to the edge of a cliff. Another awkwardness is that the CPC doesn't have buttons for diagonal up, left or right, so performing a standing jump is a nerve-wracking experience when you might accidentally send yourself plummeting off the edge. Even the combat isn't too bad, but after the last couple of ports it's just nice to play one where the buttons respond to you more than 50% of the time. It can be difficult to see the guards' attacks coming to block them, so like on the Game Gear I mostly resorted to just waving my sword around wildly, and I always felt that I was getting past guards more by luck than any skill of my own, but I did find myself improving in the time I spent with the game. However, if you've played a lot of the game, you'll notice that all of the video this time is from very early on, and this git on the lower level is the one to blame. I think the guards are slightly faster than they were in the original, and this means when you jump down next to him, you have very little time to react. If you don't time your strike perfectly, he'll knock you off the edge, you'll be sent all the way back to the start of level 2 and have to fight back to him again. It's an unfortunate, frustrating oversight in what is otherwise a surprisingly playable version. I did get past him once, but then died to a mistimed standing jump, and even though I'm sitting here playing Prince of Persia on a Friday night, there are limits to how much of my time I want to waste. The Atari ST was another home computer that was popular in Europe around the end of the 80s, notable for being the first home computer to support MIDI as standard. However, like every other computer, it got its own version of Prince as well, and this one has some pretty distinctive, unique graphics. The colour scheme is pretty unusual, with the front of the Prince's head coloured orange and the back blue. It's possibly meant to look like he's half in shadow, but it doesn't really work. The dungeon is being overgrown with some sort of luminous green fungus, but it gets the sense of dinginess across. This version controls alright, everything's responsive, but it doesn't seem to have a frame rate limiter, instead speeding up and slowing down wildly like you're in the Matrix depending on the number of objects on the screen that are moving. In some situations this can mean that you leave a screen in slow motion and then enter the next one going at full tilt, leading to some embarrassing deaths. Your own movement contributes to the rate of slowdown as well, which makes timing your way through the biting gates much more difficult than it otherwise would be. The sounds are unique to this version, and some work better than others. The noise of spice emerging from the ground has real weight behind it, but sword fights are punctuated by some of the most hilarious grunts and squawks ever. Meanwhile, the music is a little grainy, but just about does its job. When you open the exit door, it plays Jafar's theme, which is a bit unnerving, but in a nice bit of consideration, it won't pause you if you're in mid-air at the time it's meant to play. Sword fighting is as good as the other movement, it's responsive and satisfying, but slightly hindered by the temporal anomaly issues that the rest of the game has. They can also be slightly harder than normal. I don't think it's my imagination that most of the guards fight a lot more defensively than they do in any other version. Similar to opening the exit door, when you defeat a guard or drink a potion, you get an irritating fanfare during which you're frozen to the spot, just like on the original Apple version. Something I haven't seen on any other versions so far is the copy protection room, which makes an appearance here, but sometimes it messes up the on-screen instructions and turns into a nightmare. But problems aside, this is very playable and probably the best version of the game that I've seen so far, apart from the DOS one. During my many different run-throughs of the game for this video, there are a couple of things that I haven't really touched on. At the end of level 7, you're presented with an unusual potion that allows you to float safely down to the ground below. On DOS, you get some floaty background music when you drink it, but on other versions of the game, they don't seem to react at all and leave you to accidentally discover that something's happened. This one, however, gives you a nice unmistakable signal. I didn't really test the upside down potion on level 9 much either, largely due to forgetting that it existed, but here it's present and correct. You also get a life-boosting potion for your trouble, which might have been there in the DOS version, I honestly can't remember. Interestingly, a little later on, you can fool the biting gate into not activating by dropping down to its level from the screen above. This was present in the DOS game and makes me wonder if this was directly based on the same code. Whether it was or wasn't, there are also some places where the tactics I'm used to just don't work. NEC, or NEC, I'm not quite sure, was the first Japanese computer manufacturer to show an interest in Prince of Persia and contributed to making the game a commercial success after its initial lackluster response in North America. Hudsonsoft and Riverhillsoft worked together to convert it to their line of computers starting in 1990, among them the PC Engine or Turbografx. This version has definitely been spruced up a bit compared to the other consoles of the time, as this was lauded as the first 16-bit machine. The introduction is given through the slowest scrolling text in the world, along with a set of illustrative portraits, and some Castlevania-style background music has been added. It also takes the chance to play a bit further with the speedrunning nature of the game, including a high scoreboard to record your most efficient time through the levels. As you'd expect, the game's graphics and cutscenes have been given a coat of paint as well. For example, the princess has been upgraded to having a bed in her bedroom instead of a pile of miscellaneous cushions. There are a couple of oddities with the new graphics, such as floor plates that close doors being completely invisible until you step on them, and the way that both helpful and harmful potions look exactly the same, making some puzzles a little unfair about their exact nature unless you have the game memorized. Here the prince has been given a turpent look similar to his appearance on the Mac, and his animation is a little erratic. Particularly during a standing jump, he seems to be tugged about a bit as if the origin point for some of his frames hadn't been set correctly. The guards have a bit of a problem as well, as Jafar seems to have hired them from the Ministry of Silly Walks. New to this version is their ability to follow you into the next room without any indication they're arriving, which will cause a few surprises. The controls and mechanics are difficult to describe. They're nowhere near as bad as some of the 8-bit consoles, but they have a lot of quirks. Many of the consoles provide a button dedicated to jumping, so you don't have to go through the awkward twist of doing a standing jump on the D-pad. This one got half the idea right, but makes the button do an upward jump instead of a forwards one, which is a little more comfortable but doesn't actually solve the problem of having to press 2 buttons simultaneously. The platform edge detection seems to be present, but a little dodgy, as you can easily jump a tile before you're meant to, and oddly the same applies to the ledge detection, which can correct you to the wrong place. The trick of crouching to avoid damage from a loose panel doesn't work, and somewhat unfairly, you can be hit by a chopper while it's opening. Level 10 shows a particularly unusual difference, as you can't sneak along the lower level and then stab the guard in the back, meaning you have to go the long way around, and I can't even remember if this was an option on the DOS version. You make your way a couple of screens over, pull yourself up to the level above, and then knock all the tiles down above him. Again, on most versions, this would take him out of the picture, but here he's completely unbothered by masonry breaking over his head and you have to fight him anyway. And speaking of the fighting, it's much less good than the rest of the movement, although it isn't quite as bad as it first appears. Some of it is just different. When you enter a room with a guard, the prince takes a surprising amount of time to decide whether to fight him or stand there and greet him with a friendly handshake, and if you're not already on guard by the time he reaches you, he can cut you down instantly. This is broadly true across all versions, but most of the games are a little more forgiving if you are at least facing the guard. When you fight the first few guards, combat feels sluggish and awkward. Unlike any other other version, you can block continuously, but you can't strike straight out of a block, and so you'll find yourself being knocked backwards a lot. The guards also strike faster, so if they get in while you're trying to attack, there's no way for you to defend yourself. This causes a real problem on the fight with the skeleton, where you need to keep advancing, but before long I realised that it was better to inch forwards by waiting until he attacked, than to counter-attack and move up while he was recovering. This version has a new feature in the form of a speed menu where you can alter how fast you move and how quickly combat goes, surely messing up a lot of the game timing. I put it on maximum so that I could turbo my way through level 5 and then realised that I was certainly no worse at combat for it. In fact, it revealed a surefire way to win against non-bosses, which was just to stand a safe distance away, whirling my sword in the air and waiting for the guards to obligingly blunder into it. This would present a problem with the guard at the start of level 8 who doesn't move until you come into range yourself, but fortunately in this version he doesn't quite stand far enough away and you can likely graze him to death easily. Something that surprised me a bit later on in the game was that there's a completely new tile set for the brief level that serves as your victory march to the princess. Or so you think. Jafar suddenly turns up here and teleports you out to a bridge for the true final fight. I'm not sure why, maybe he doesn't want to get blood on his carpet or he just preferred the scenery. This makes me wonder as to who you fought in the usual place was that a body double or a magic-induced illusion or maybe his secretary? Weirdness is aside though, unlike all the other console versions I've shown up to now, this one is reasonably okay if not perfect, and there aren't any massive bugs or issues that will prevent the prince saving the kingdom, celebrating by having his race changed, and then sending you on your way with a truly unique phrase of congratulation. The Megadrive version of Prince of Persia by Domark is unplayable. I want to put that forward first because a couple of the things I'm going to say next might accidentally make it sound good. Thankfully it's nothing like the Master System one, but it comes with its own completely different set of issues. Part of the reason that there are so many different Prince of Persia games is that it was released as the 8-bit era was ending and the 16-bit consoles were starting out, meaning that it was released for both old and new systems simultaneously as well as all the computers of the time, and virtually nobody worked on the same port. In this version, the palace has been relocated to a tropical island somewhere, and to show off the Mega Drive's 16 bits of power, they gave the game a large graphical overhaul. As a result, the game looks great. The background and foreground tiles are varied with a lot of decoration, and they're much more bright and colourful than any of the other versions so far. Touch plates stand out much more obviously against the stone or carpet floor, but unfortunately they chose to make the open and closed tiles identical to each other. Moving through these nicely redecorated levels ranks among the most frustrating experiences I've ever had on any port of this game. Controlling the normally agile prince feels like guiding a 5-ton excavator through a lake of jam. It takes ages to start or stop running, the time it takes him to turn around can be measured with a sundial, and he's too slow to even step through the biting gates without being cut in half. Pressing up on the D-pad doesn't work when you're trying to do a running jump, and the platform edge detection is non-existent, so unless your timing is extremely good, you will be smashing into the ground a lot. The rules for spikes are also different, catching you when you try to run through them even when they've already sprung and should be avoidable. In general, there are just no niceties to the movement, everything is completely unforgiving, leading to things like this absolutely hateful moment on level 3. And on top of all that, a fade has been added when you move from one room to another. It's brief, but definitely enough to throw you off your rhythm if you want to make a running jump just after arriving on the next screen. The guards suffer no such agility problems and are very fast to strike in combat, making defending yourself very difficult indeed given how responsive the block button is. Uniquely, you can't press up to block either and have to use the jump button, which is tricky to remember, especially as pressing jump alone doesn't do anything normally. You have to use it in combination with left or right to do a standing jump. If you do successfully block, you're sent skating back about half a screen and will probably fall off something, and you don't get the chance to strike out of a block either. Needless to say, this makes combat unfairly difficult at best. Interestingly, the American and European releases of this game are fairly different from one another, something I discovered when I checked the USA version because I couldn't believe the game was meant to run as slowly as the PAL one did. America gets the standard 12-level run with the graphical changes I've mentioned and without the speed boost I was hoping for, but Europe gets a few extra levels among the standard 12, bringing the totals to 16. Having a bit of extra content is welcome, but a lot of the new rooms are fairly boring, especially as they're much harder than the other levels that surround them. If the controls were reasonably operable, having more levels would feel like a challenge rather than a way to prolong the crushing slog through the game. The European introduction is different as well, including a shot of the prince being rolled down the dungeon stairs like a baggy-trousered Easter egg, and you'll be accompanied on your way with some well-intentioned but ultimately irritating background music. It's a shame because the new levels do have some interesting ideas in them. The new 7th level is a treacherous run through spikes and choppers, ending with the revelation that you forgot to open the exit door and have to go all the way back and the other way around. But if you go down a bit at the left-hand side, you find a potion that stops time, making all traps harmless except the dodgy controls. It's a nice new idea and feels like something the original game might have included, even if it does have a tendency to wear off at inconvenient moments. So that's the Mega Drive or Genesis Prince of Persia. It's almost an excellent version, but falls down on such a fundamental level with the controls that it isn't. A frustrating experience if ever there was one. In the tradition of many Mega CD games, you would expect its version of Prince of Persia to be the same as on the Mega Drive with the background music classed up a bit, but they're actually completely different games. This one was put together by Bits Laboratory and is obviously based on the Turbografx one, inheriting some but not all of its problems. I'm not sure how the licensing works out for that, but there we go. As was common when game manufacturers suddenly found themselves with the untold vastness of space offered by the new CD format, they wanted to find a way of filling it, and they chose to do it here by including fully voiced cutscenes in an anime style that appears to have been produced by Strongbad.
Free the princess and leave this place forever!
There are only a couple of them at the start and end of the game, but they are absolute gems in their own way, recasting the prince as the biggest doofus ever.
Don't worry. When the Sultan returns, everything will be alright.
We can only be thankful that they didn't do this in live-action FMV. But on to the game. You're sent on your way with only 59 minutes, which seems a bit of a swindle from the outset, and you move pretty slowly. Fortunately, the speed menu makes a return here, and I could tune it up a notch to make it more comfortable. Otherwise, controlling Prince Doofus is much smoother than it was in the Turbografx. The dedicated jump button still goes straight up, but that's about the limit of the control oddities, and the kinks have been worked out of his animation. If there's one thing I could find fault with, it's that the input is buffered just a little too long during animations that stop you. For example, pressing down by accident while drinking a potion can have dire consequences. Fighting has been made much more responsive as well, a real surprise given that getting both jumping around and sword fighting right is something of a rarity in conversions of this game. The guards are intelligent, you might say too intelligent, as this one knocked me off the end of the platform and then just pushed me away when I tried to get back up, requiring me to go off and die somewhere else to restart the level. But when you get to fight them, everything goes well, apart from that the sprites don't quite line up with your hitboxes sometimes, and you'll see swords clashing together in mid-air. Graphically, the game is nice. This one makes the levels stand apart from each other a little more by mixing and matching different backgrounds with the tile sets, which gives each one a little more personality. Again, like on the version that this was built on, the door closing plates are invisible until you step on them. There's also no momentary clearing of the screen when you walk out of one room and onto the next, which I found disconcerting for reasons I can't really describe. If the rooms are similar to each other, it can look like the blocks are just shifting around a bit and you're entering the same room again. As you would expect from everything bar the Nintendo version, all the important moments of the game are intact, although the spontaneity of the fall to level 7 is somewhat marred by the massive CD loading time. And once again, after defeating what used to be the final boss, you find yourself on a bridge at the end of the game for the last face-off with Jafar, who the characters insistently pronounce as Jaffa, like an orange-filled biscuit cake.
Jaffa!
I am terrified of Jaffa.
It is Master Jaffa's orders. Your father may be angered if he sees us together, and banish me along with Jaffa. I will save you and crush Jaffa's ambitions forever!
Overall, this is a good version. The presentation is a bit misguided, as I've mentioned, but the actual game part works very well. And of the things to get wrong about this game, putting in some unintentional hilarity in the form of the cutscenes is a very mild one. But finally, I want to present to you the fanfare at the end of the game, which just doesn't want to leave the stage. And you think that's got to be the end? Let's leave it, let's go on to the Super Nintendo. After the shambles of most of the console conversions, you would be forgiven for thinking you're hallucinating the Super Nintendo version of Prince of Persia. It was handled by the unfortunately named Arsys software and was among the later conversions released towards the end of 1992. Very unlike its original Nintendo counterpart, which was released at the same time, it's fast, it controls perfectly, you won't find yourself falling 50 stories or being skewered because the game ignored your button input. It's basically fantastic. A little thing I really love is that even though there's a dedicated jump button, the game allows you to use it for clinging on as well, doubling your chances of fumbling to grab onto a platform suddenly. In this version, the graphics were given a huge overhaul with a complete background layer and many of the rooms given unique artwork instead of a purely tile-based maze, and the game takes you through many more environments instead of just the palace and dungeon that most other versions stayed with. Each set of about 3 levels also has its own unique music. All this would make it easily the best version of the original Prince of Persia on the consoles, if it were the same game that everybody else had ported. Your first hint that something's different is when the game hands you 120 minutes at the outset, fully double the time limit that the original game had. The first level proceeds pretty much normally until you get to the sword room, where you suddenly find yourself descending into a forgotten mine and then finding the sword at the end of an underground river. From there you'll go off on your vaguely familiar quest that will take you through stages that look somewhat like the original levels, interspersed with some completely new ones, making 20 in total. If you know the PC version by heart and get confident about it, you will definitely find yourself being caught in new traps and plummeting down holes that weren't there, which isn't a problem, but it's worth mentioning. The additions to the levels mean that they're longer on average, which can be frustrating when you have to do them all again after a death, but restart points are given for most of the more potentially aggravating ones. All the classic moments are intact, although most of them are shuffled around a bit. On level 6, instead of encountering good old Fatty, She-Ra, Princess of Power, jumps out to give you a fight. This is just the first of a large number of completely new bosses and traps dotted throughout the game. When the shadow throws you down the pit, you fall not back into the dungeon, but straight down to a fiery, eye-hurting version of hell, where you have to fight your way up through skeletons who aren't above playing dead to get the advantage. In the middle of the game, you start encountering the historically dubious conveyor belts of doom installed in the palace, and you'll have to get past blades, smashes, and weird wooden things that golf you backwards on your elongated journey to save the kingdom. In all this newness, I find it a bit of a shame that they didn't do anything to the combat. All you have to do to get past most of the bosses is get the rhythm of blocking and striking right. With the changes they made to the game, they could have made it something less monotonous, perhaps giving you high and low strikes or something, but it says something when my main complaint is that the port does something accurately. And there are a couple of special cases, like the moment towards the end of the game where you're suddenly fighting an ancient octo-god that rains skulls down from the ceiling. Prince of Persia on the Super Nintendo is an excellent game, and it's easily the best one to be called Prince of Persia, even though it's much closer to being a sequel than a port. The game got a genuine numbered sequel designed by Jordan Mechner as well a couple of years later, but I'll examine that in another video. Ah, right, it's finished. So, that was my adventure through 12.5 versions of Prince of Persia, a fascinating game for how differently it was handled or mishandled across its various ports. If asked to rank them, I would do it something like this. The Super Nintendo one is fantastic, even though it's a different game. The DOS, Sega CD and Macintosh versions are firmly in the good category, with the Apple II, Atari ST, Turbografx and Amstrad CPC being decent attempts that got caught in the limitations of the hardware. On the lower end of the scale, the Genesis, Game Gear, Game Boy and original Nintendo versions did their best, but unfortunately their best was rubbish. If you have other thoughts, speak up about them in the comments, unless you're an idiot, in which case just go away. So, for a finale, do you want to see all 12 versions playing level 1 at the same time? Well, if my PC can handle it, that's what's going to happen. Thank you for watching, hope you learned something interesting, and see you next time.